Today, we take you on a journey through one of the most impactful events recorded in the United States during the war. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know the places and times of day or night these documented accounts reach. Hazy winter light filtered through the tall windows of the executive mansion as President-elect Abraham Lincoln sat alone at his desk. His lanky frame hunched forward, brow furrowed in concentration. Before him lay a document that would forever alter the course of American history. It was December 24th, 1860, and the declaration that South Carolina had officially seceded from the Union had just arrived by special courier. The document, formally titled Declaration of the Immediate Causes which Induce and Justify the Secession of South Carolina from the Federal Union, represented the first official break in what many had long feared might become a fractured nation. 7 southern states would soon follow South Carolina's lead, but this was the first, a constitutional crisis unprecedented since the founding of the Republic. Lincoln's long fingers traced the edges of the paper. The Springfield lawyer and former congressman had won the presidency just over a month earlier, on November 6th. Yet he wouldn't officially take office until March 4th. In this strange interregnum, he could only watch as the nation began to dissolve before he even had a chance to govern it. James Buchanan, the lame duck president, had already stated that while he believed secession was illegal, he had no constitutional authority to stop it. The burden would fall squarely on Lincoln's shoulders, shoulders that already seemed to sag under the weight of what was to come. Lincoln reached for a small leather-bound volume on his desk, his pocket constitution. For years he had carried this copy with him on the judicial circuit, annotated with his own careful notes. Now, as he read through South Carolina's declaration, he checked their constitutional arguments against his own understanding of the founding document. In the present case, the declaration proclaimed, that fact is established with certainty. We assert that 14 of the states have deliberately refused for years past to fulfill their constitutional obligations. Lincoln's eyes narrowed. The declaration primarily cited northern states' refusal to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act as justification for secession. The document made clear that South Carolina saw slavery as central to its existence, and Lincoln's election as an existential threat to the institution. What history did not record was the exact moment Lincoln finished reading the declaration. No stenographer took down his first words, no photographer captured his expression, but 3 people would later provide accounts of what happened next. John Nicolay, Lincoln's private secretary, would later write that Lincoln sat in complete silence for several minutes after reading the document. According to Nicolay, Lincoln then simply set the papers down, removed his spectacles and murmured, "So it begins." William Seward, soon to be Lincoln's Secretary of State, recalled that when he visited Lincoln later that day, the president-elect was surprisingly calm. "He told me he had been reading South Carolina's justification," Seward noted in a letter to his wife. "Lincoln said something I shall never forget, that the Union was older than the states, and no state had the right to simply walk away from it." The third account came from Mary Todd Lincoln, who wrote to her sister that her husband had stayed up late into the night after receiving the declaration, drafting notes for what would eventually become his first inaugural address. "Mr. Lincoln believes firmly that this crisis will pass," she wrote, "though I fear he underestimates the determination of these Southern firebrands." What Lincoln did next was meticulously documented. He began corresponding with trusted political allies, seeking input on how to address the crisis. He insisted he would make no public statement until becoming president. This strategic silence was deliberate, allowing him time to formulate a response that might preserve the Union without igniting immediate conflict. Behind closed doors, however, Lincoln was clear about his position. In a private letter to Alexander Stephens of Georgia, his former congressional colleague, who would soon become Vice President of the Confederacy, Lincoln wrote, "Do the people of the South really entertain fears that a Republican administration would, directly or indirectly, interfere with their slaves or with them about their slaves? If they do, I wish to assure you, as once a friend, and still I hope not an enemy, that there is no cause for such fears." But what most concerned Lincoln about South Carolina's declaration wasn't its arguments about slavery. It was its fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the Union itself. In notes found among his papers after his death, Lincoln had written, "The Union is not a voluntary association of states. It is a perpetual bond created by the people as a whole, not by the states individually." This would become the core of Lincoln's constitutional argument against secession, that the Union predated the states and no state could unilaterally withdraw from it. Yet privately, Lincoln recognized the political reality that 7 states had already left before he took office, with more threatening to follow. Captain Theodore Talbot, a military officer who met with Lincoln in January, recalled that the president-elect had South Carolina's declaration on his desk, with certain passages underlined. Most notable, according to Talbot, was that Lincoln had highlighted the section where South Carolina omitted the phrase, "all men are created equal," from its reference to the original Declaration of Independence. "It speaks volumes, doesn't it?" Lincoln reportedly told Talbot. "They refuse to affirm the very principle upon which our republic was founded." During those tense winter months, Lincoln quietly prepared for the coming crisis. He assembled his cabinet, selecting political rivals like Seward and adversaries like Salmon P. Chase to create what historian Doris Kearns Goodwin would later call a team of rivals. But Lincoln said little publicly about South Carolina's declaration or the other secession documents that followed. Instead, he focused on crafting his inaugural address, working through multiple drafts. The final version would directly address the constitutional arguments made in South Carolina's declaration, though without specifically naming the document. "I hold that, in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual," Lincoln would declare in his inaugural address. "Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments." Major Robert Anderson, commanding the federal garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, sent Lincoln a personal letter describing the tension in South Carolina. "They believe their declaration grants them sovereignty," Anderson wrote. "They expect you to recognize it. I fear bloodshed if you do not." Lincoln's reply was simple: "Hold firm. Help is coming." On February 4, 1861, as Lincoln was preparing to leave Springfield for Washington, a new document arrived, the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. 7 states had now formed a rival government, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Unlike South Carolina's declaration, this document was a framework for governance, though it explicitly protected slavery and the right of secession. Lincoln studied this document carefully as well. According to his secretary John Hay, Lincoln observed that they have formed a government that looks very much like our own, except where they have explicitly protected what they fear I would take from them, though I have repeatedly said I would not. As Inauguration Day approached, Lincoln received troubling reports of possible assassination plots. He traveled to Washington in disguise, arriving safely but somewhat embarrassed by what some newspapers mocked as cowardice. The city itself was tense, with Southern sympathizers abundant and fear of violence in the air. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office on the eastern portico of the Capitol. In his inaugural address, he finally responded publicly to South Carolina's declaration and the secession movement it had spawned. "Physically speaking, we cannot separate," Lincoln declared. "We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. A husband and wife may be divorced and go out of the presence and beyond the reach of each other, but the different parts of our country cannot do this. Lincoln rejected the constitutional arguments presented in South Carolina's declaration and insisted no state could legally secede. But he also extended an olive branch. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The president closed with a powerful appeal to what he called the better angels of our nature, hoping that reason and shared history might yet prevent war. His words would not prevent conflict. Just 41 days later, Confederate forces would fire on Fort Sumter, beginning 4 years of bloody civil war. What Lincoln truly thought when he first read South Carolina's declaration remains largely a matter of historical conjecture. We have fragments of evidence, reported conversations, and later actions. But the private thoughts of that somber man in that critical moment are lost to history. Some historians believe Lincoln immediately recognized war was inevitable. Others suggest he maintained hope for peaceful resolution until the first shots were fired. What seems clear is that Lincoln understood the gravity of the moment, that the document before him represented not just a political crisis, but a fundamental challenge to the American experiment itself. Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, a young protege of Lincoln's who would become one of the first casualties of the war, later recalled visiting Lincoln shortly after the secession declaration arrived. He wasn't ranting or pacing, Ellsworth wrote to his parents. He was studying the document as if it were a legal brief, making notes in the margins. He told me, "They make some compelling points about states' rights, Elmer, but they fundamentally misunderstand what our founders created." The declaration that so troubled Lincoln would be joined by similar documents from other seceding states. Mississippi's declaration was even more explicit about slavery, stating, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." These documents, crafted to justify breaking the Union, would instead serve to clarify the central issue of the conflict. While Southern leaders initially emphasized states' rights and constitutional theory, their own declarations made it impossible to separate these arguments from the institution of slavery they were designed to protect. In the weeks between receiving South Carolina's declaration and taking office, Lincoln received constant updates from the South. Military installations were being seized, provisional governments formed. The newly established Confederate government began appointing officials, establishing departments, and preparing for possible war. Lincoln's private secretary recorded that the president-elect kept South Carolina's declaration in his desk drawer and would occasionally take it out to study it. "There must be some way to answer this that preserves both the Union and the peace," Lincoln reportedly said. If such a way existed, it was never found. The constitutional crisis sparked by South Carolina's declaration would be resolved not by legal arguments, but by 4 years of warfare that would claim over 600,000 American lives. What began with a document ended with a surrender at Appomattox. Lincoln would not live to see the full restoration of the Union he fought to preserve, falling to an assassin's bullet just days after Lee's surrender. The document that started this cascade of events, South Carolina's Declaration of the Immediate Causes of Secession, remains preserved in the state archives in Columbia. Its yellowed pages bear witness to a moment when American democracy faced its greatest test. Perhaps the most revealing insight into Lincoln's reaction comes from a letter he wrote to Illinois Congressman Elihu Washburne on December 26, 1860, just 2 days after receiving South Carolina's declaration. Lincoln wrote, "Please present my respects to the General Assembly and tell them I shall, to the best of my ability, defend and preserve the Constitution of the United States. That includes every state, even those that may not wish to be included." Lincoln understood that South Carolina's declaration represented not just a state's decision to leave, but a challenge to the very idea of American nationhood. His response, first in private reflection, then in careful preparation, and finally in decisive action, would define his presidency and reshape the nation. Historians still debate whether the Civil War was inevitable or whether different leadership might have prevented it. What seems clear is that Lincoln, upon reading South Carolina's declaration, recognized both the constitutional stakes and the likelihood of conflict. In the silence of that December day, as winter light faded outside the windows of his Springfield home, Abraham Lincoln confronted the document that declared the Union dissolved. His response, though not captured in the moment, would be written across 4 years of national agony and ultimately in a new birth of freedom for the country he served. According to a diary entry by Mary Todd Lincoln, dated January 8, 1861, her husband had told her, "They think they're leaving the Union, but in truth they're bringing the issue of our national soul to its final crisis. The Constitution cannot survive half slave and half free forever. I had hoped the resolution would not come in our time, but now that it has, we must see it through." In that moment of first reading, Lincoln the lawyer likely analyzed the legal arguments. Lincoln the politician surely calculated the political ramifications, but Lincoln the statesman, the man who would soon be president, understood that the fate of the American experiment hung in the balance. What Abraham Lincoln said when he read the Confederate Declaration of Independence was perhaps less important than what he did in response to it: preserve the Union, end slavery, and ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, should not perish from the earth. The winter of 1860 to 1861 marked the beginning of the greatest challenge the United States had ever faced. It began with a document, a declaration of separation. It would end with a new understanding of what it meant to be one nation, indivisible with liberty and justice for all. According to Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase, Lincoln kept a copy of South Carolina's declaration in his desk drawer throughout the war. He said it reminded him of what we were fighting against, Chase recorded in his diary. Not just disunion, but the idea that any state could break the covenant of the American people whenever it disagreed with the national will. What Abraham Lincoln thought when he first read South Carolina's declaration on that December day in 1860 set in motion a chain of events that would transform America. The quiet determination that formed in those moments would sustain him through the darkest hours of national trial. The final word on Lincoln's reaction may belong to the man himself. Years later, after the war had ended and Lincoln was gone, a letter was found among his papers, apparently drafted but never sent, addressed simply to the people of South Carolina. It read, "You claim the right to secede based on the Declaration of Independence. You forget that document speaks of all men being created equal. Until that promise is fulfilled for all Americans, our founding work remains unfinished. The Union must be preserved not just for ourselves, but for all who would seek freedom in this world and in all the generations to come." Whether Lincoln actually wrote these words or they represent historical wishful thinking remains debated. But they capture the essence of how Lincoln came to view the conflict that began with a declaration and a response not just of words, but of actions that would determine the fate of the American Republic. What Abraham Lincoln said when he read the Confederate Declaration of Independence changed American history. His private reaction became a public stance that preserved the Union, ended slavery, and ensured that the United States would continue as one nation under a single constitution. From those tense December days of 1860 to the victory and tragedy of April 1865, Lincoln's journey and America's began with a document and a decision that the Union must be preserved. Historian James McPherson notes that Lincoln kept a folder labeled "The Case for the Union" throughout his presidency. The first item in this folder was his annotated copy of South Carolina's Declaration. It served, McPherson writes, as both a reminder of what threatened to destroy the American experiment and as motivation to ensure it would survive. In the end, what Lincoln said matters less than what Lincoln did. His response to South Carolina's declaration, measured, constitutional but ultimately unyielding in defense of the Union, defined his presidency and saved the nation. It was not the response South Carolina's secessionists expected or wanted, but it was the response the moment of crisis demanded. As the terrible carnage of civil war unfolded across the American landscape, the constitutional arguments of South Carolina's declaration faded against the brutal reality of combat at places like Antietam, Shiloh, and Gettysburg. The legal theories gave way to the sacrifices of hundreds of thousands of Americans, fighting and dying for their vision of what the country should be. Lincoln's secretary John Hay perhaps captured the essence of Lincoln's response best when he wrote, "The president didn't rage or despair when secession came. He simply, calmly, and with iron determination resolved that it could not stand." That resolution, formed in the quiet moment of first reading South Carolina's declaration, would carry Abraham Lincoln and the nation through its darkest hour and into a new dawn of freedom. Among the papers found in Lincoln's desk after his assassination was a worn copy of South Carolina's Declaration with extensive notations in the margins. Next to the passage claiming that the northern states had violated the Constitution by failing to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, Lincoln had written, "If non-enforcement of one law justifies secession, then any disagreement could dissolve the government. No nation can survive such a principle." Professor Harold Holzer, a leading Lincoln scholar, suggests that Lincoln's initial reading of South Carolina's declaration may have crystallized his constitutional thinking about the nature of the Union. Lincoln had long opposed the expansion of slavery, Holzer notes, but the secession crisis forced him to articulate a comprehensive vision of American nationhood that went beyond the slavery question. In January 1861, as more southern states followed South Carolina's lead, Lincoln began receiving a steady stream of correspondence from both Unionists and secessionists. A letter from Robert Barnwell Rhett, one of the architects of South Carolina's Declaration, has survived in the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society. Rhett had written directly to Lincoln, defending secession as the logical culmination of state sovereignty. Lincoln's response, never sent but found in draft form among his papers, stated, "A nation is more than a contractual arrangement between sovereign entities. It is a covenant between generations, between the founders and their posterity, to secure the blessings of liberty. No single generation can dissolve this covenant without the consent of all." As Lincoln prepared to leave Springfield for Washington in February 1861, he took with him several key documents, including South Carolina's Declaration and his annotated copy of the Constitution. According to Ward Hill Layman, Lincoln's friend and self-appointed bodyguard, the president-elect studied these documents on the train journey, as if seeking in their words some solution to the crisis that might yet avoid bloodshed. In Washington, as Lincoln waited to assume office, 7 states had formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. The two men, Lincoln and Davis, represented starkly different visions of America's future. Davis embraced the constitutional theories outlined in South Carolina's Declaration. Lincoln rejected them. Naval Lieutenant David Dixon Porter, who helped escort Lincoln safely to Washington, later recalled a conversation with the president-elect. "Mr. Lincoln told me he had spent many nights analyzing South Carolina's arguments," Porter wrote. "He said the document was skillfully crafted to appeal to constitutional principles while avoiding the central moral question of slavery. On March 3rd, the day before Lincoln's inauguration, James Buchanan signed his final piece of legislation, an amendment to the Constitution that would have permanently protected slavery where it already existed. The proposed amendment, known as the Corwin Amendment, was an attempt to prevent war by constitutionally guaranteeing what Lincoln had already promised politically: non-interference with slavery in existing states. Lincoln did not oppose this amendment, consistent with his stated position, but he recognized that it addressed only one aspect of South Carolina's declaration and would not resolve the fundamental constitutional question of secession itself. The morning of March 4th dawned with heavy security throughout Washington. General Winfield Scott had positioned sharpshooters on rooftops along Pennsylvania Avenue, fearing assassination attempts. It was against this tense backdrop that Lincoln delivered his inaugural address, responding not just to South Carolina's declaration, but to the secession movement it had launched. The address was both conciliatory and firm. Lincoln extended an olive branch to the South, affirming he had no intention to interfere with slavery where it existed. But he also firmly rejected the constitutional theory of secession, declaring, "It follows from these views that no state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union, that resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary." The words echoed his private notes from when he first read South Carolina's declaration. What had begun as a quiet, scholarly analysis in Springfield had become the official policy of the United States government. Lincoln would not recognize secession as legitimate under any circumstances. Major George Hartsuff, stationed in Florida when news of Lincoln's inaugural reached him, wrote to his commanding officer, "The President has directly challenged the legal theory put forward by South Carolina. War now seems unavoidable." Indeed, Lincoln's rejection of secession's legitimacy left the new Confederate government with a stark choice: accept that their independence was not recognized by Washington or force recognition through military action. They chose the latter course. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. When news of Sumter's fall reached Washington, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The constitutional dispute that had begun with a declaration would now be settled on the battlefield. Captain Charles P. Stone, assigned to security during Lincoln's inauguration, later wrote that as the news of Fort Sumter's surrender was delivered to the President, Lincoln said simply, "So, they have chosen war rather than let the nation survive. The question is settled. The Union will be preserved by force if necessary." Throughout the ensuing conflict, as battlefield fortunes rose and fell, Lincoln never wavered from the position he had formed upon first reading South Carolina's declaration, that secession was illegal, that the Union was perpetual, and that his constitutional duty was to preserve it. As the war progressed, Lincoln's thinking evolved on many issues, most notably on emancipation. What had begun as a war solely to preserve the Union became, with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, a war to end slavery as well. Yet Lincoln's fundamental constitutional position, formed in that moment of first reading South Carolina's declaration, remained unchanged. "This is essentially a people's contest," Lincoln told Congress in July 1861. "It is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government, whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. These words represented the fullest expression of what Lincoln had recognized when he first read South Carolina's declaration, that the crisis was about far more than constitutional theory or sectional interests. It was about the viability of democratic government itself. General George Meade, who would later command the Union Army at Gettysburg, met with Lincoln in early 1862. According to Meade's correspondence, Lincoln told him, "When I read South Carolina's declaration, I understood immediately that we faced not just a rebellion, but a fundamental challenge to the American experiment. Can a democratic republic survive if any faction can dissolve it when they lose an election? The answer must be yes, or we have failed before the world." As the war entered its second year, Lincoln kept a copy of his annotated Constitution on his desk in the White House. Attorney General Edward Bates noted that the president often referred to it when discussing constitutional questions raised by wartime measures. He had worked through these issues thoroughly in his mind, Bates wrote, beginning from the moment he first read South Carolina's secession declaration. The constitutional crisis initiated by that declaration forced Lincoln to exercise extraordinary powers as commander-in-chief, suspending habeas corpus in certain areas, instituting military trials for civilians, and eventually proclaiming emancipation as a war measure. Each action was justified by the necessity of preserving the Union against an unconstitutional rebellion. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles recorded in his diary an exchange with Lincoln in 1863. "I asked the president if he had anticipated such a profound constitutional crisis when he first read South Carolina's declaration," Welles wrote. He replied that he had recognized immediately the fundamental nature of the challenge, though he had not foreseen the extent of the bloodshed that would be required to resolve it. As the war dragged on, costing hundreds of thousands of lives, Lincoln never lost sight of the constitutional principles at stake. In his address at Gettysburg in November 1863, he defined the conflict as a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal can long endure. The words implicitly rejected South Carolina's declaration, which had carefully omitted the equality clause from its references to the founding principles. Lincoln's new birth of freedom would ensure that the nation emerging from the war would more fully embrace the principles that South Carolina's document had rejected. By 1864, as Lincoln stood for re-election, Union military success made the outcome of the war increasingly clear. The constitutional crisis sparked by South Carolina's declaration would be resolved decisively in favor of the Union's perpetuity. Frederick Douglass, who met with Lincoln several times during the war, later recalled, "Mr. Lincoln told me he had studied the South's justifications for secession carefully. He said their constitutional arguments were skillful but fundamentally flawed. They treated the Union as a mere contract between sovereign states, when it was in fact the expression of the American people's will to form a single nation." As the war neared its end in early 1865, Lincoln's second inaugural address reflected on the conflict's deeper meaning. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. The address, delivered on March 4, 1865, came exactly 4 years after Lincoln had first officially rejected the constitutional arguments made in South Carolina's declaration. Now, with victory imminent, Lincoln looked toward reconciliation. "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." 1 month later, on April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The military phase of the crisis that had begun with South Carolina's declaration was effectively over. The constitutional question had been settled by force of arms. The Union was perpetual, and no state could secede. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. The president who had preserved the Union would not live to oversee its reconstruction. What had begun with Lincoln reading South Carolina's Declaration in December 1860 had ended with the preservation of the Union and the abolition of slavery. The constitutional crisis had been resolved, though at terrible cost. The final word on Lincoln's response to South Carolina's declaration perhaps belongs to Charles Sumner, the radical Republican senator who delivered a eulogy for Lincoln on June 1, 1865. When others wavered in the face of secession, Lincoln stood firm, Sumner said. He recognized from the first moment that the constitutional doctrines advanced by South Carolina were incompatible with national survival. South Carolina's declaration remains preserved in the state archives. Lincoln's notes and annotations on his personal copy, lost for many years, were rediscovered in 1897 among papers belonging to John Hay. These documents, one asserting the right to dissolve the Union, the other refuting that right, represent the constitutional crossroads America faced in 1860. What Abraham Lincoln said when he first read South Carolina's declaration may never be known with absolute certainty, but what he did in response defined American nationhood for generations to come. His rejection of secession's constitutionality, first formed in that moment of reading and later implemented through 4 years of war, established permanently that the United States is a nation, not a confederation, a perpetual union that no state has the right to leave. This constitutional principle, forged in the crucible of civil war, remains fundamental to American government today. It began with a document and a response, South Carolina's declaration and Lincoln's rejection, that together precipitated the greatest crisis and transformation in American history. As darkness fell on that December evening in 1860, as Abraham Lincoln set aside the papers declaring South Carolina's separation from the Union, he could not have known the full magnitude of what lay ahead. But in that moment, confronting the document that challenged the nation's very existence, Lincoln began formulating the response that would preserve the Union and create a new birth of freedom for all Americans. What Lincoln thought, what Lincoln said, and most importantly, what Lincoln did when confronted with South Carolina's declaration changed the course of American history. The quiet lawyer from Springfield, facing an unprecedented constitutional crisis, responded with a firm determination that the American experiment in self-government would not fail. "The fiery trial through which we pass," Lincoln told Congress in December 1862, "will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation." In choosing to confront secession rather than acquiesce to it, Lincoln ensured that the light would indeed be one of honor, a nation preserved, slavery abolished, and the promise of American democracy kept alive for future generations. Dr. Allen Guelzo, a leading Civil War historian, suggests that Lincoln's constitutional thinking crystallized in the moment he first read South Carolina's declaration. He recognized immediately that secession threatened not just the Union, but the viability of democratic government itself, Guelzo writes. If states could leave whenever they lost an election, no democratic republic could endure. The principles Lincoln articulated in response to South Carolina's declaration, that the Union was perpetual, that secession was illegal, and that majority rule within constitutional limits was essential to Republican government, have endured as foundational elements of American constitutional law. In Texas, Verst. White decided in 1869, the Supreme Court affirmed Lincoln's view, declaring, "The Constitution, in all its provisions, looks to an indestructible union composed of indestructible states." Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase, whom Lincoln had appointed, wrote that the Union was not a mere compact between states, but rather a perpetual relationship that no state could unilaterally terminate. What began with Lincoln reading a declaration ended with a constitutional principle permanently established, that the United States is a single, indivisible nation. The President's initial response to that document, developed through careful constitutional reasoning and implemented through determined action, preserved the American Republic in its hour of greatest peril. As Lincoln himself said in his annual message to Congress in December 1861, it continues to develop that the insurrection is largely, if not exclusively, a war upon the first principle of popular government, the rights of the people. In that observation lies the essence of Lincoln's response to South Carolina's declaration, a recognition that what was at stake was not merely the territorial integrity of the United States, but the survival of government of the people, by the people and for the people. Lincoln's legacy, the preservation of the Union and the abolition of slavery, began with his response to that declaration. What Abraham Lincoln said when he read the Confederate Declaration of Independence changed America forever, ensuring that a nation conceived in liberty would have a new birth of freedom and would not perish from the earth.